Hi guys, welcome to the ISTAT Learning Lab. We're going to continue our theme of the path to recovery. We heard Bob Lange from Airbus on May 11th, and we heard Rodrigo Silva Sousa from Embraer on May 18th. And those sessions are available on recordings on istat.org if you haven't heard them yet. And today we're going to see or hear Boeing's view on this. And to do that, we have Darren Hulst, who is Vice President of Commercial Marketing for the Boeing company in our studio in Seattle. He leads a team that markets the company's family of commercial airplanes and services by understanding market requirements and contributing to planning and product development and supporting market positioning and sales activities. Darren joined Boeing in 2005 and has served in various leadership positions in marketing, including network and fleet planning, sales strategy, market analysis, regional marketing, and analytical sales support. Before Boeing, Darren was with Delta Airlines for 8 years, serving in various management roles in network and scheduling planning and revenue management. He graduated from Valparaiso University with degrees in economics and geography. So during Darren's presentation, you can post questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write in your questions. And then after Darren is finished, I'm going to go over those questions together with Peter Negelin, who is in our studio in Singapore. Peter is the
Hello there.
Head of Strategy and Market Research, BOC Aviation. And before I hand over to Darren, I just want to mention that on June 9th, we're going to have another learning lab on structuring a sustainable finance transaction with BNP Paribas. And then on the 15th of June, we have a session on sustainable air travel from Airbus. And with that, I want to hand over to Darren Hulst from Boeing.
Morning. Thank you, sir. Let me see. Hopefully everything's good with that. Good morning, everybody. I realized when I agreed to do this, I don't know if I realized it was 7 a.m. the day after the first long weekend of the year here in Seattle. But I look forward to sharing a little bit of our perspective on the market, what we're seeing in the market. And there is some good news, as we've seen in the United States and some other parts of the world in recent months. And in fact, an acceleration of the recovery, especially in domestic markets. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through the next 45 minutes or so. So I'd like to start with a little bit of a look back at last year. And of course, last year, we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on, we've already lived through it. But just to set the table in terms of what 2020 was like in terms of the global GDP. Not only was it a recession, it was a worse recession in terms of the volume, in terms of the magnitude than the global financial crisis. The industry on the side of travel obviously was even more impacted because of the global lockdowns, because of the global impact of the virus. We saw almost 62 million job losses, at least temporarily, in travel and tourism. And the industry saw a 66% decline in passenger traffic, something we've never seen before. In fact, an order of magnitude worse than what the industry's ever seen. But obviously, we're not in 2020 anymore. However, the beginning of 2021, I wanted to give you a little bit of a dashboard of where we are in the recovery and what things look like as we go through this year, and ultimately what the fundamentals are for travel and for aviation. So the first piece of the dashboard is what are the airplanes doing? Interestingly, if we look at where the aviation market is today, about 80% of the airplanes that were flying before the virus began are back in service. There are about 4,000 to 4,500 parked aircraft more than were parked or stored in early 2020. However, the number of operations, the level of flights around the world are only still at about 60% of pre-virus levels, maybe a point or two above 60%. So you can see the airplanes are back in service. The flights aren't at the same level of intensity, which means we're seeing lower productivity in terms of the overall transportation system as the world waits for a lot of the unlocking or the restrictions to be removed for travel to be fully resumed. And then ultimately, this is, I think, maybe the most sobering statistic in that passenger traffic is still about 35 to 40% of normal. This is based on some data that we've collected. It's based on preliminary IATA data, and then what we've seen during the May timeframe in some parts of the world. Still 60 to 65% less traffic on the passenger side than we saw before the virus in 2019. So you've got more airplanes flying less flights, and passengers are still at a point where we don't have the enablement for full occupancy. We don't have the enablement for a lot of international travel. And so really the focus is on domestic recovery as we've started 2021. Now, I do want to give a little bit of really good news as far as we look at the United States. I think the two biggest bellwethers for how the recovery will occur will probably be the United States and China in terms of the aviation systems. You can see here about a 14-month comparison of passenger screenings or passenger traffic as a proxy compared to the same month in 2019. And as you look, the last 3 months have been an incredible increase of a rapid acceleration of passenger traffic in the United States as the virus became under control, as more reopening occurred, and as vaccinations reached a rate that reduced the case counts throughout the country. We're looking at levels of traffic in the last few days that is at 80 to 85%, right, roughly 80-85% of 2019 levels. And in fact, the only reason we're not seeing more traffic based on our analysis is because there aren't more seats in availability. Load factors over the weekend were over 90%. So there would have been more traffic if there were more seats. And I think it just speaks to the pent up demand that exists in the US market. And you can kind of see this here. I know there's a number of lines here, but I'm looking at the seats available between January and July. So looking back, looking forward, you can see we've just finished the month of May where there were about 27% fewer seats in May than there were in 2019. And if you look back to the left-hand side, only 33% fewer screenings. So we've gotten to the point where passenger recovery is tracking with seats. And as we look through June and July, you can see mostly domestic here, the seat capacity, the available flight frequencies and services is getting above the 80% of normal levels. And that's occurring primarily in the smaller aircraft, but rapid improvement or increases in wide bodies as we move into the summer. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about three major sectors of the market. I'm sure everybody is following each of those just like we are. And I'll start with the best one. So instead of building to the best, I'll look at straight into the most healthy or the by far the most healthy sector of aviation, which is air cargo. We've seen air cargo benefit from multiple factors, shortage of passenger belly capacity, the challenges in supply chain bottlenecks, either at ports or in other parts of the system that have driven some products to air cargo from other forms of transportation, all of which have driven record levels of yields. In addition to, over the past few months, we've seen the highest levels of air cargo tonnage and volumes than we've ever seen in the history of air cargo. So we've got near-term dynamics, and we've still got the long-term structural fundamentals that are driving air cargo to be a very, very strategic and important part of commercial aviation. I'll start with the near-term parts. You know, we've got significant wide-body passenger capacity losses. So in normal times, about 50% of air cargo capacity and traffic is due to passenger scheduled wide-body flights. If you take that number down by 60, 70, or 80%, what that results in is a shortage of air cargo capacity by about 20 to 30%. We all know the rules of supply and demand, or the laws of supply and demand. So when supply comes down and demand remains at or above historical levels, that's driven yields 30, 50, 60, even 100% higher than it was in pre-virus times, which makes it really, really good to be a freighter operator these times. So we've got that combination of aviation capacity loss, maritime challenges, and then the disruptions that have existed as the world has gone through this shock economically. So what's that driven? Well, air cargo capacity, the passenger freighters, or sorry, passenger aircraft being such a limited role in today's market means that dedicated production freighters are providing about 3/4 of air cargo capacity. That's significantly different than the roughly 50% that we saw before the virus began. And again, underlies the importance, the strategic value of production freighters as part of the transportation system. Will it change? Absolutely, it will come back to pre-virus levels in some form, but it just underscores the value in times like these. The other thing that's really interesting is we've watched, I think, from a near distance, the container ship dynamics in the marketplace and the challenges that the shipping industry has seen, and also the benefits that the shipping industry has seen. What's interesting is we also track the relationship between air cargo rates and container ship rates. And historically, as we know, air cargo is a premium because of its ability to carry things long distances very quickly. Historically, air cargo is about a 12-to-1 premium in terms of the rate relative to container ship. Even though air cargo right now is seeing record levels of demand and yield, so are container ships, and so are containers. And so as a result, it's interesting to see that actually air cargo is at a discount to the relative rate when you compare to container ship yields over time. So it'll be interesting to see if that dynamic drives even more near and medium term traffic to air cargo in the marketplace. But in the long term, I think we still need to look at the bigger picture. What are the fundamentals? In our minds, there's really, I would say, 2 to 3 big drivers in terms of where air cargo fleets will go in the next decade and 2 decades. One is structurally, we've seen a shift towards e-commerce business models, and we were not going to see a change. That trend is going to continue. That's going to drive more demand for regional and long haul freighters in the marketplace. The other driver of demand is just simply replacement. Almost half the fleet needs to be replaced in the next decade. That's driving the demand for both converted and new production freighters that will renew the fleet and drive even more efficiency into the system. And then I guess the other questions are, and we don't have all the answers, is how do supply chains shift, and what does that mean for the dynamics of dedicated freighters and freighter networks? So from our perspective, I think we're looking at the trends in the market, what that means for our customers' requirements, and also when do our customers need to see new aircraft in the market to replace aging fleets that have existed in the market for 40 or more years in some cases, and also the newer fleets that need to see more efficient, more capable products to help drive the cargo system through the next 2 decades. So the passenger side of things is obviously challenging and remains challenging, but from our perspective, I think it's really 2 speeds, and the 2 speeds are diverging in terms of how passenger recovery is happening through 2021. We talked about this last year, how we saw a 3-speed recovery, domestic first, regional next, and long haul last. It's actually happening, and maybe more pronounced. The differences are more pronounced than what we even expected. So this is a look at domestic traffic versus 2019. We think that in April, we'll be close to, on a global level, domestic recovery near 3/4 of 2019 levels. So you can see, again, similar to the US TSA numbers, dramatic recovery since February, but still a ways to go as we move through the rest of this year. The challenge, of course, is the fact that domestic traffic on a global basis only accounts for 1 in 3 revenue passenger kilometers on a normal basis. That means you really need international to restart before we can really see the cap lift off where the aviation industry can recover. And I think that's very important as we move through the northern summer season that starts essentially now. But in the domestic markets, I think a couple things to note. Load factors, which are a proxy for demand and certainly not always a proxy for yields and revenue, have been on a very rapid upward trajectory. I think when we see May traffic data from U.S. carriers, which is never quite transparent, we will see load factors mostly above 80%. This is a look at April. When we look at other countries, China, Russia, even some big markets in emerging countries, we're seeing load factors well above 70, getting close to 80, in some cases above 80%. That's an indicator of the demand that's out there, the pent-up demand that's out there, but also the ease of travel, relatively speaking, between domestic as opposed to international markets. Now, I also want to highlight the fact that as we look through history, how networks have evolved, how airlines continue to expand and develop their system has followed a pretty similar path. Airlines look to expand their networks with new services, more frequencies, and tend to do that on a pretty consistent basis. If you look over the last 5 or so years, domestic markets have added somewhere between 1 and 2,000 city pairs per year for each of the last 5 years. Now, as we look from 2020 and 2021, you can see we're seeing airlines still look for ways to innovate with networks, new point-to-point routes, new services to take advantage of the leisure demand that exists in the market. However, there are also routes that have been canceled or temporarily suspended. And so this year, I think the key as we look into domestic markets is airlines need to be agile, versatile with their fleets, with their planning to take advantage of the dynamics that exist in the marketplace. And I think from our perspective, maybe the past is in many cases a good predictor of what we'll see in the future, which is the medium size, the heart of the market continues to be a big center of gravity for how airlines kind of balance the risk versus the reward as they look at planning, as they look at where can I expand, where can I add frequency, and how do I do so in a way that benefits profitability and competitiveness while also minimizing risk. And I think what's interesting from our perspective as we look at the market today, the average single aisle, I would say above 125 seat capacity is about 167 seats, which kind of balances again that cost per flight, the risk versus the cost per seat, the unit cost that airlines have been chasing throughout the history of aviation. So that balance, I guess, is something that airlines will be looking to find as we move through the recovery into expansion or acceleration, especially in domestic and regional markets. Now, the international space, I saved this for last, not because it was the most fun to talk about, but because in many cases, it's the one that we really need governments to help enable. International traffic is still only about 12 to 13% of 2019 levels. So down 85 to 90% from normal pre-virus traffic demand. It's not because the demand isn't there, it's because there are restrictions around how citizens can travel between countries. And it's unclear exactly how those restrictions and when those restrictions will be removed on a bilateral or even a broader basis. And I think as we look at the international markets, we've studied the same things in long haul markets that we've studied in short haul markets, which is airlines continue to find ways to innovate with new frequencies, market expansion, new city pairs served, and that was consistent throughout the second half of the last decade. What's happening in 2021? Airlines are still looking for how do they find new revenue streams. In some cases, it's overflying routes that were served prior to the virus temporarily, or even as ways to access new revenue streams. But we've seen a significant amount of routes that remain suspended because of the lack of ability to serve those routes with full demand of traffic. As we look at the recovery, I mean, my sense and how we look at how airlines are planning for the recovery, sure, we're going to see continued looks at new markets, but we're also going to see airlines build back from their hubs, leverage the global alliances, leverage partnerships and joint ventures to help feed and build traffic to a sustainable level until such point as some of these markets continue to come back on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's how we'll see the long-haul market evolve. What's very interesting from my perspective is that in some cases, the international or the long-haul market follows or mimics things that we see in shorter haul single-aisle markets, in which the wide-body average seats per flight have gone up over time. Not because the airplanes have been getting bigger, but because airlines have found ways to densify cabins. Maybe you don't need first class anymore. Maybe there's other ways to create capacity and ultimately revenue and productivity. But we're also seeing a downward push from the top end, where airlines are saying, I don't want the risk anymore of a airplane that I can only use in a segment of my global network. So we're seeing pressure from both sides as airlines look to, in some cases, upgauge to drive down unit costs, but also downgauge to drive down trip costs. So some of the same risk reward things that we've observed in the single aisle market are happening and have been happening in the wide body space. A year like 2020 and early 2021 accelerates that. And that's where you see the average seats per flight come down pretty significantly relative to the trend that we had been watching over the last 5 years, essentially bringing us back to about 2015 in terms of average wide body capacity on long haul routes. And I think, again, it's airlines making the decision of what's my future network look like? How do I best balance the risk and reward, and also take advantage of new technology to fly and profitably fly the network I need to fly. So what does that mean in terms of the fleet? I think that you can see here in a different way how the pressure has moved towards the middle. Airlines are looking at new technology airplanes that have capability of the big airplanes of the previous generation. They look at the capability of some of these wide bodies that can carry tremendous amounts of cargo in addition to the passengers that drive the profitability on their aircraft. And so 2/3 of the active fleet is in that space between the 777, the 787, and the A350 types. And those types are somewhere between 70 and 90% active relative to the total fleet, which is significantly higher than the overall wide body percentage. So again, airlines are looking for that agility, versatility, but also minimizing risk as they look for how the networks and how the global aviation system will recover internationally. Okay, so the fleet dynamics really are a fallout of the things that we've talked about. Agility, versatility across fleets, but also you add in the dynamic of age as well as airlines make some decisions about where their fleets will be. This is a synopsis of where the fleets were about a week ago in terms of active versus stored or parked. And you can see we've built in the history from January of 2020. So you could see how many aircraft were parked or stored even pre-virus and where we are today. Like I said earlier, we're about 80% of the pre-virus fleet, but that's about 74, 75% of the total fleet, because we're always going to see somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 aircraft in storage through transition, going through heavy checks or reconfigurations. However, we haven't seen a significant increase in the size of the active fleet through the period between late last fall and mid-spring. What we've seen since March and April is a slow increase, about 50 to 100 aircraft a week re-entering service since about mid-April, as airlines prepare for the capacity they're going to need for the summer, but aren't fully deploying the capacity in terms of seats, scheduled flights, and the resumption of networks, partially because of the restrictions that still exist between countries. So the dynamics you can see above, single aisles are relatively more active, obviously more domestic deployment, Wide body is a little bit less. However, you'd expect the wide body number to be significantly lower if the aircraft weren't able to carry a tremendous amount of cargo. So a lot of, I should say a fair amount of versatile wide bodies, airplanes like the 777-300ER or the 787-9 or 10, those aircraft are able to be deployed to carry cargo only in a very profitable, very efficient way to take up some of the slack that exists in the system that's not being satisfied by normal passenger wide body capacity. So at the end of the day, freighters still benefit the most. Over 100% of the aircraft that were in service pre-virus are in service today. In fact, the productivity of the freighter fleet is pretty impressive, and we'll talk about that in a second. But as we look at the various fleet types of the single aisle and the wide bodies, you can see the newest, most flexible types are the ones that are tending to have the highest levels of activation and productivity as airlines look to take advantage of those assets during times like these. Here's a little bit more into the productivity of the marketplace. So we're looking at, as airlines make decisions about schedules, about fleets, we're looking at how full the airplanes are and ultimately how much the airplanes are being used as a way to help guide how many more aircraft will be returning to service and when. Load factors in the market still remain around 60%. Well, that's a long ways away from where the industry was and will get back to in the coming years. Single aisle utilization is a little bit higher, relatively speaking, but still significantly below, maybe 30% below what utilization in terms of hours and cycles were relative to pre-virus levels. So as we look towards the future, you can see there's a lot of capacity that still inherently exists in today's aircraft before airlines need to add significantly more to the system. And this is a little bit of a technical chart, but I did want to show freighter productivity because it is such an outlier relative to the passenger fleet. We look at three segments of freighter aircraft. We look at the large freighters above 80 tons. So that would be the 747s, the 777s, and the leftover MD-11s that exist in the system. Then we look at the medium space, which would be somewhere between 40 and 80 tons. So 767s primarily, especially for us, and this is our data, that exist in that express medium haul space in the market. And then you have the small aircraft like all of the conversion single aisles that exist in the market. And I think what's interesting to see, if you look at the solid line, which is a 12-month moving average, you can see the utilization of the freighter fleet over the last 12 months has increased significantly. So not only have we seen more aircraft return to service, but airlines, operators, lessors are finding ways to use the aircraft even more productively. About 120% of normal productivity is coming out of today's freighter fleet relative to pre-virus levels. And a lot of that is from the large freighter space, the ones that are flying the furthest. But you can see notable improvements from both the small and the medium freighters as well as they move more e-commerce through regional and domestic networks. So ultimately, as we look at the parked fleet as where we are today relative to where we could be, we can all look at the parked fleet and try to figure out what that means. We can also look at it maybe one level deeper, which is how long have some of these types been in storage? How long have some of these types been inactive? And is that a predictor of where the market and where the fleet will ultimately go? Because as we know, the longer the airplane stays parked, the more other options for the aircraft come into consideration, such as conversion, part out, or other uses. And so from our perspective, I think, or from my perspective, looking at the dynamics of the aircraft that have been in storage longest help to give a sense of where some of these airplanes may go in the future. And on the single aisle side, you can see some of the older previous generation types. There's about 700 or 800 of those that have been stored for 18 months or more. And on the wide body side, similarly, some of the older, less capable types have seen longer storage periods and ultimately might find their way into other uses in favor of some of the types that drive more efficiency and ultimately maybe even more sustainability into the global network as well. So I think this is an interesting page to watch, place to watch as we move through the summer is how do some of the aircraft that have been in storage longer, do they move or not move out of storage, and where do they move to as we move through the peak 2021 season? From our perspective, and from historical perspective, I guess you could probably say, we see last year, this year, and the immediate future being a time where airlines really look at restructuring fleets, looking for the right aircraft types and capabilities that will set the stage for their recovery and ultimate movement back into expansion phases. During normal times, pre-virus normal times, on an average annual basis, about 2 to 3% of the active fleet is removed or retired from service. So in, say, 2020 or 2019, you had maybe 20,000 single aisle and wide body jets. That would dictate about 500 airplanes per year that would be removed from service. Over the last two crises, the two major crises that impacted aviation, the global financial crisis and the post 9/11 timeframe, the 5-year average of retirements or removals almost doubled compared to average time. So instead of 2 to 3%, we're looking at close to 5% of aircraft that were serving before the crisis that were removed from service. And I think our view is that something similar happens as a result of this global crisis. And you can look to the right to see there are a significant amount of aircraft, either stored or active, 20 years old or more, that become candidates from a timing perspective as far as being ready to be removed from service. So we look at how the industry has evolved. One thing to also look at is how fast the industry had been growing in the period between 2011 and 2020. In some cases, that had retained, airlines had retained more aircraft in their fleet than what they normally would have, because we had a great combination of demand at record levels, input costs like fuel at low levels. And what that drove is potentially a little bit longer lives of certain aircraft types that this resets. And so as we look to the future, I think we see very similar trend to what we saw after the two major crises play out in 2021, 2022, and then reset the fleet as we look towards expansion and continued evolution of the global network as we move through this year. So economically speaking, what are we seeing? I think the one great news piece, or one of the great news pieces of how the industry or how the global economy is moving through this crisis is that all signs continue to be positive at a global level for key economies and the global economy to actually be higher and larger than it was before the crisis hit. So this is just some of the numbers. GDP globally will be about 17% larger than it was in 2019. GDP per capita will be higher. Population will continue to grow. But in some cases, projections for level of economic activity are higher than they were before the crisis hit, if that makes sense. It's essentially a hypothetical world where the crisis didn't hit. Economies are growing faster now because of the stimulus packages, because of activity that has been pumped into the system to help the global market recover. And so here's where you can see some of that in play already. By the end of 2021, or by the end of this quarter, global GDP level will be higher than it was at the end of 2019. That's a very rapid recovery from a very, very challenging situation in 2020. Obviously, it's not uniform across regions. However, that's going to help pull the global economy higher as we move through the rest of this year. The other thing that's fascinating to watch, and something that we're obviously watching closely, especially as a service, as aviation and other parts of travel as a service industry, the savings rate is significantly higher than it was before the crisis. you can see the savings rate on that line. And then the bars represent where the savings rate in the US has been in the last 4 or 5 quarters. Now what we're seeing is excess savings in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 trillion in the global economy, and a lot of that is in advanced economies in the US and Europe. That money is pent up, ready to be spent once restrictions to travel and other activities are relaxed. And I think it gives us a pretty high level of confidence that the demand will be there when it's enabled. And then consumer confidence, obviously that's key for us to watch. And the trajectory as we've moved through the last 6 months is definitely encouraging as we look towards consistent recovery through most of the world here. The other thing is, and I won't even try to define what we're looking at here, but this is just containment indexes around the world. And I think the key thing to look at is as we move towards the summer and fall of 2021, more economies will be more open. What that's going to enable is more movement of people, goods, services, and ultimately aviation traffic, not just in domestic markets, but in international markets as well. And I think that's a key enabler of air travel, and in a way that we've never seen in previous crises, where governments have to enable the travel to actually happen before we'll see that full international recovery. I think every one of us is acutely aware of how important travel and tourism, whether it's leisure or business travel, is to global economies. And you can see, from all metrics, 10% of global GDP is driven by travel and tourism. That's why the recovery of travel and tourism is so important to a healthy global economy, and also healthy businesses and commerce around the world. And so our view, in addition to the value for connecting people and families and leisure traffic, is that business travel is so important and will remain a foundational piece of how companies do business, grow businesses, develop businesses, and develop their own growth trajectory. And it's one thing to maintain a relationship like we are doing here for a period of time electronically. It's another thing to build a relationship, to expand the network, and to ultimately develop business relationships that go beyond the maintenance level. And so as you can see from some of these numbers, business travel is a tool not only for us to connect, but it's also a tool for increased sales, increased profits. And as the world reopens, I don't have any doubt that while new communication technologies have helped us cope with the challenges that we've seen, they're not a replacement or a proxy for a steady state way of doing business. And I think, again, it's really hard to transfer all the know-how or the people knowledge that you have just via electronic means. And I think what we'll see in many cases is that some of these technologies we're using today are great complements to business travel, but not a replacement. And so from our perspective, we're already seeing signs of how business travel is recovering, and very encouraged by seeing our customers who have pointed to some of the initial green shoots they've seen in their businesses. So what does that mean for us? Our view of the recovery is that domestic markets recover first, regional markets recover second, and long-haul markets recover third. But I would say the range of our recovery timing is between 2023 and 2024. And let me try to clarify exactly what I'm saying. We see that there may be some months in 2023 where the global industry hits the level of RPK traffic that we saw in 2019. However, on a 12-month rolling basis, it'll probably be early 24 when you have 12 months that add up to the calendar year 2019 levels of traffic. Domestically, I would argue we're almost more optimistic than we were 6 months ago about the recovery because of what we've seen empirically in the markets in the US and China, in some of the other major markets around the world. Internationally, I don't know that I'm discouraged about the demand. I think the biggest challenge, again, is that government restriction, the enablement of travel, because the demand is absolutely there. How will airlines recover? Well, domestic's going to lead. Airlines are going to innovate networks to help capture dynamic demand in the market. Low-cost carriers are absolutely well positioned to take advantage of a lot of that leisure traffic. But as we get to the regional and long-haul space, the age-old or the generations-old refinement of how airlines have developed hub-and-spoke networks is going to help and be foundational to the recovery of medium-haul and long-haul traffic. And so we'll be very interested to watch how airlines continue to reshape and constantly innovate to take advantage of the demand dynamics in each of their markets. But on the whole, our view is 2023, early 2024 return to 2019 traffic levels. And as we look at the medium term, I think this is worth spending a second on. Is I talked briefly about 2010 to 2019. We saw record passenger traffic growth rates. Fleet growth rates were above average. This 5-year period from the beginning of the crisis to 2024, 2025 is going to reflect a loss of 2 years of growth. However, our view is that the market fundamentals, what's driven the aviation network and the market for the last 40 years hasn't changed significantly. In fact, in some cases, we're seeing more accelerators put into the system. And so as a result, we see those long-term fundamentals of 4 to 5% annual traffic growth, a 2 to 3% global fleet growth, and traffic on the cargo side that in some cases actually above the recent historical trends, continuing to drive the market this decade. What that means for us as far as our outlook, we shared this last year. We'll obviously do the same thing again in 2021 with a commercial market outlook. But what you see here are two slices, a 10-year and a 20-year view of global delivery demand for passenger and freighters. And you can see that the first 10 years are significantly below half of the 20-year forecast. Again, you reflect almost 2 years of lost growth in 2020 and 2021, and then a recovery back to the long-term trend. To the point where you see in the right-hand side that the airplane deliveries that we have over 20 years is only about 5 or 6% below the forecast that we had before the virus. You have fleet renewal requirements. You have sustainability in terms of new aircraft technologies. And then you have the impact of what happened in 2020 and 2021, driving more demand through the system as emerging economies resume the rapid growth trajectories that we've seen in the past. And so that's our outlook for the global demand for aircraft. And then here you can see a little bit more of that 10-year view, since we are again in this short-term view of the marketplace. What do we see in 10 years? Well, first we see the fleet growing and continuing to push a little bit eastward in terms of the center of gravity being closer and closer to Asia from a global fleet perspective. However, you can also see our view of fleet replacement and growth dynamics has flipped. Because of the 2 lost years of growth, because of the impact and its magnitude of the last 2 years, we're going to see this decade more airplane deliveries function as replacement aircraft than airplane deliveries driving growth in the system. That's just a function of how impactful the last 2 years have been. However, the fleets will return to growth. In some cases, they've already returned to growth, and we will see a system in the end of this decade that includes close to 34,000 jets in the global passenger and freighter network. So I try to think of things, and maybe you guys do the same thing. I try to think of things and organize my thoughts to help understand and learn from some of these challenges, but also to see how the industry is evolving. And I try to think of the last 3 crises that we faced. We faced 9/11, we faced the global financial crisis, and now we're facing and recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Each of these, I think, has its own interesting dynamics, and some of those were in place before the crisis hit. Some of those are a result, but ultimately the aviation market got smarter, got more productive, more efficient, and more profitable. In the case of 9/11, airlines had to deal with cost competition. And so we saw a restructuring of how airlines had managed their costs and managed the way they competed in the marketplace. After the global financial crisis, airlines had to find a way to be more productive. We saw some consolidation. We saw airlines drive more capacity discipline in certain parts of their networks, and ultimately got way more productive with their assets, driving far more traffic and capacity out of their fleet than in previous generations. As we move through the recovery of COVID-19, I think from my perspective, what we're going to see, the tagline is going to be about versatility. Airlines are going to find ways to be more versatile with their networks, with their business models, and with the fleets that they fly. And I think our responsibility is to look to provide that versatility, that flexibility that enables the airline system to continue to be healthy and resume its growth trajectory. And so from my perspective, what does versatility mean? Well, it means you need to provide the most capability with the lowest cost. It's that balance between risk and reward again. We look at the future of aviation and even the future of many things around the world. We need to look at sustainability. The generations of airplanes that are delivered need to be more efficient, but also have even more sustainability view as we look at what else can we incorporate into the system to help bring the benefits of aviation balance against, obviously, the challenges of emissions as we move into the next few decades. So we want to enable our customers, the aviation market, to have the ultimate flexibility with networks. And ultimately what that's going to do is drive the capital, drive the financing towards the most versatile assets, the most flexible assets, the types of aircraft that can sustain and withstand competition and other challenges and thrive in any environment. And the last thing I'll just say is we're looking in the near term and the medium term and the long term constantly at how we continue to enhance the sustainability of aviation. And these are just 4 sections, 4 areas that we continue to focus on, because in my mind, in our mind, it's not just one solution to help drive sustainability and the sustainability goals that the industry has put forth for the next 3 decades. It's about how airlines replace their fleets today. I think some of the things that we're seeing are a direct result of a long-term sustainability view. And every aircraft that gets replaced is somewhere between 15 and 30% more efficient than the airplanes that were flying before. Operational efficiency, what can we do with the systems to help enable either more efficient air traffic management or other ways how airlines and airplanes move through the system even more efficiently. Energy transition, we talk about biofuels, sustainable aviation fuels. How do we move that forward in combination with the other aspects of sustainability? And then in the future, obviously, we're always innovating, and the key is to drive technology to a point where all of these aspects together can help solve and satisfy the aviation goals for sustainability that the industry has set forward. So I want to end on this, and it's, I think, an important thing for us all to remember, because when you're in the middle of a crisis, it's hard to have bigger picture perspective. This is a look at the last 45 years of global air traffic. And the pink line, or I guess it's the pink line, you can see is the trend, the average growth rate of aviation over time at a 5% annual level. A couple of things we can see very quickly: how remarkably resilient the aviation traffic has been over time, how in some cases we've actually seen more growth than we would have expected in recent years because of how important aviation is to the global economy. And I think from our perspective, there's no question that those fundamentals help bring aviation back to where it was before the virus, and then past that, back on the trajectory it was following before the pandemic impacted aviation so profoundly. So this big picture perspective, I think, provides the confidence that we need about the resilience and the growth industry that we're also passionate about. So thank you very much for your time. Hopefully it was valuable and useful. And I think it complements some of the things we're all hearing and seeing ourselves. But I look forward to seeing how the next few months help further bolster our confidence in aviation going forward.
Thank you, Darren, so much. I think we had a technical issue because the actual slides stopped at the one that was headed economic recovery. So I think it's important that we can get those slides and post them on the ISTAT website on the recording so that the audience can review those slides after this. But we have quite a few questions that have come in, and I want to hand over to Peter Meglin to start off the question round.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Niels. Thank you very much, Darren. Would like to just start as with the first question from Alistair, and it's on air cargo, where he asks, it has tended to be largely one way, more cargo going from China to the US or Europe than goes back into China. Are you seeing improved cargo load factors in both directions?
I would say yes. I mean, there's still no doubt in some of the largest traffic lanes around the world, there's still a certain element of directionality that exists. But I think that during the crisis, we've seen a little bit more balance because of some of the supply chain disruptions and other things that have existed in the system. I don't think there's any doubt we'll continue to see some imbalance in the way air cargo flows, though.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. The next question is from Shanith. It says, they ask, I might have misunderstood one of the graphs related to the TSA data, that on the right-hand side of the slide, there was a graph showing the seats from different aircraft segments, regional, narrow body and wide body. The question is, does the dramatic increase in seats for the wide body relate to domestic or international routes?
Yeah, that would be international. So as we move through the summer, we see a lot more. That was North America or US schedules. So you can see those would be flights to, from, or within the US. And the wide body capacity or the wide body schedules that have been published show a pretty rapid increase in published wide body seats, especially in June and July. So we need, first of all, I think that we will see those flights operated, but the key enabler is the restrictions that exist between countries in order for those airplanes to be full. But that is truly a driver as we move into the summer.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Sunda, and he asks, in your opinion, which of the changes due to COVID-19 will be permanent? One is reduction in corporate travel, and the second is reduced demand for wide body aircraft. But I might add a third and say both.
That's a great question, and I don't think. I mean, as we look, we'll be able to look at this in 5 years' time, and maybe do a little bit more of a post-mortem on how the industry recovered and what changed. But in my perspective, business travel permanently or structurally changed, I don't see it. I think we lost 2 years of business travel growth, just like we lost 2 years of a lot of things in the marketplace. Will that mean that the industry doesn't recover to where it was, or business travel doesn't recover to where it was in 2019? No, I think we'll see business travel back at 2019 levels. Will it close the gap from where it would have been? That's a great question. I think a lot of that remains to be seen. The wide body side of things, I think that's an interesting question, because as airlines look around the dynamics of their networks, I think the key focus is going to be versatility. We're not going to see airplanes that are deployed or bought for single route purposes. It's all about where the heart of the market is in terms of the demand, and how can they be deployed across 70, 80, 90% of long haul networks. And I think that is definitely a key item to watch.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Doug, who asks, what happens when wide-body passenger aircraft return to carrying passengers instead of freight? Is there a bubble in yields and the number of freighters that will be burst and create an oversupply of freighters in 2025, or will the demand be sustained?
I think there's a lot into that question, but what I think is what's going to happen is you're not going to see record level of yields forever. The supply demand imbalance is such that right now is a great time for air cargo yields. As airlines put passenger aircraft back into passenger networks that'll help balance out the system a little bit more. However, that's not going to rapidly increase the supply of cargo capacity. Some of these aircraft that are flying, cargo only flights as passenger aircraft, now that they get deployed back into the passenger network, we're not going to see a real big change in capacity. It's just about where the airplanes are flying. So from my perspective, the yields, yes, those aren't sustainable forever. There's no way you're going to see a doubling of yields and just hold on. However, the demand is there. And so I don't think there's an oversupply of freighters, but I think you'll see a natural settling in terms of the utilization of the fleet, some of the aircraft that probably need to be retired that have been held into the system because of the massive value that they can generate. Some of those things settle out over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Douglas. He asks, IATA's recent forecast moves forward the point at which we recovered to global 2019 traffic levels by more than 1 year to some point in 2023. But it forecasts that, unlike in previous crises, that we will not get back to the pre-crisis traffic growth trend line. And I think you've covered this to some extent already. Do you agree with both of these assessments?
I think we agree about the recovery for sure. We've been back and forth with IATA on sharing some of our views, and they've shared some of theirs. And I think ultimately we're probably a little bit more optimistic as they are about the market today than we were a year ago. Relative to the return to trend, there's so many ways you can determine trend. So if I say the long-term average growth rate of aviation has been 5%, you could, depending on where you draw the line or snap the line, I could justify return to trend on the 40-year basis or where we were, say, in 2019. And so from my perspective, the key thing is we're going to recover back to the trajectories that the industry has seen, 4 to 5 to 6% annual growth rate in passenger traffic. And so whether we attain the same levels we would have without the crisis, I think that's probably unlikely. However, the same drivers and the same trajectories that we saw in the industry before the crisis, I'm very confident we'll reattain those levels.
Okay. The next question is from Thomas, and he asks for Boeing's thoughts on the recent IAE net zero report, where they estimate that capping long-haul leisure travel at 2019 levels and reducing 15% of regional flights that are transferred to high-speed rail will reduce emissions by 50%. Will governments push for restrictions of traffic to meet zero emissions?
That's a great question. I honestly haven't studied that well enough to know exactly what the implications are. I mean, I'll go back to what we said what I said at the end, which is we think that there's multiple levers that the industry can activate to help with our sustainability goals, and it's more than just one thing, more than just one driver, and I don't think it's just long haul. It's the sustainable aviation fuels, it's the new product technology replacement, and the system itself that helps enable the industry to achieve its goals.
Okay, thank you. Douglas asks, and there's many questions here, so I'll try and simplify it by asking two parts of it. Do you see the heart of the market for narrow bodies changing from 167 seats over the next 5 to 10 years? And does the average wide body size continue to shrink?
Okay, so the size of the aircraft, I think, the last 20 years are a great proof point in how the industry demand has changed in the single aisle space. And I think we've seen a natural upgauging, whether it's either the size of the aircraft or the density of the aircraft, by about 1 to 2 seats per year in the single aisle space. I think that pauses slightly, but stays on a similar trajectory. So we'll probably see small increases in the average seat size on single aisles, but the heart of the market still remains below 190 or 180, 185 seats. On the wide body space, I think this crisis makes this kind of a bigger jarring impact in terms of the size of the aircraft because of the fact that airlines are looking for the ultimate versatility. And so I think we will probably see the average seat size come down a little bit from the 300 into the 285 to 290 seat space, which is kind of where you see the major production of capable, kind of twin engine wide bodies.
Okay, and the last question for you from the audience is regarding fuels. How would you consider the aviation industry could benefit or take advantage of generous opportunities in the global market? I assume that's something to do, probably related to sustainable aviation fuels, I would think.
Oh, right. So I would probably defer that question to our experts in the environment or in the sustainable aviation fuel space, other than to say, you've seen our stated goal for all of our products to be capable of 100% SAF, 100% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. And we're looking for ways to help increase those percentages in the near term. I unfortunately am not an expert on all the intricacies.
No problem. Thank you, Darren. That's all I've got for you, Niels. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Well, I had a couple of questions. Darren, you mentioned that about 20% of the fleet that was active before the crisis hit are now inactive. And you also mentioned in another slide that there were about a similar amount of aircraft that were over 20 years of old in the fleets. Do you think that it's likely that those 20% that are inactive today, still inactive, are heading to the scrap heap?
Well, I think the scrap heap is probably a little bit of a dramatic term. I would say what we've seen already is airlines and even lessors look at their fleet and say, which of these aircraft continue to be marketable in the passenger space? Which of these airplanes can I take advantage of demand for cargo, for a conversion capability? So even, for example, 26, 27-year-old 767s are in conversion programs right now for passenger to freighter conversion. And then the last piece would be, like you said, scrap or the used serviceable material for the aircraft, especially if they're types that are less capable, less efficient than the airplanes that are replacing them. And so I would say, in general, the older, the longer the aircraft are parked, the higher the likelihood that they don't come back. However, there still are some interesting uses for these aircraft in the medium term, and the conversion space is one where we're seeing a lot of demand.
Okay, but if I understand it correctly, I mean, you're basically saying that we may not catch up to the level of traffic that we would have had if we hadn't had the crisis, but we should reach the same type of growth rate, though.
Correct. Yep.
Now, so that should also have an impact on the production rates from the OEMs, right? So how do you see that recovering from the severely reduced production rates that we've seen during the crisis?
I think right now the industry is managing what we said before, which is the aircraft that have been parked or stored or have been in some level of transition. We're also managing, the airplanes that we have built or are building for customers in this near term. But we've seen strong demand, especially from our U.S. and even some European carriers, for future growth needs or replacement needs. And I think we'll see that on a more broad global level as we move through the end of this year. And so I'm pretty optimistic that the industry gets back to or towards, production rates that we saw before the virus. But it's going to take years. It's not something that snaps back, in the middle of 2022, for example.
But I would assume that will have a negative impact on the profitability of the OEMs. And what does that mean in terms of having the funds to develop the next generation aircraft? It's been it's been a challenging year for the whole system, right? And the last year, in terms of deliveries, in terms of working with our customers, I think our priority has been working to find mutually beneficial or mutually acceptable solutions
that keep us both moving forward. And now as we move towards a recovery phase, I think that's where you start looking at what are the needs, what can we do to help airlines build back their fleets and restructure for accelerating times. So I think the key is finding those solutions. The second piece of your question, though, is as we move through the recovery, things will be getting better for us as an industry and for us as a manufacturer. And one thing that we will never stop doing is innovation. And so we continue to look at what is the right product at the right time with the right technologies that we can bring to the market with and for our customers to help drive aviation even further. So we can't ever stop that part.
Thank you. Peter, any final question? Okay. So Darren, thank you so much for this. And thank you, the audience, for having dialed in. And I hope that within a couple of days, you can have the full PowerPoint presentation available on ISTAT.org's website and download that. And then there would also be a recording of the narrative. Thank you so much, and see you back on June 9th with BNP Paribas. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, everyone.